Welcome. I'm Eric Fleming, host of A Moment with Eric Fleming, the podcast of our time. I want to personally thank you for listening to the podcast. If you like what you're hearing, then I need you to do a few things. First, I need subscribers. I'm on Patreon at patreon.com/A Moment with Eric Fleming. Your subscription allows an independent podcaster like me the freedom to speak truth to power and to expand and improve the show. Second, leave a 5-star review for the podcast on the streaming service you listen to it. That will help the podcast tremendously. Third, go to the website, momenteric.com. There you can subscribe to the podcast, leave reviews and comments, listen to past episodes, and even learn a little bit about your host. Lastly, don't keep this a secret like it's your own personal guilty pleasure. Tell someone else about the podcast. Encourage others to listen to the podcast and share the podcast on your social media platforms, because it is time to make this moment a movement. Thanks in advance for supporting the podcast of our time. I hope you enjoy this episode as well. Hello, and welcome to another Moment with Eric Fleming. I am your host, Eric Fleming. And today, we're going to have a good show. We're going to have a couple of authors on. One is going to talk about an issue that is very prevalent in society that we just kind of ignore. We see it every day, but we don't really do anything about it. Then another author kind of details his journey into politics. And it's a very, very fascinating journey. And very timely as far as what's going on in the election, which, by the way, I hope y'all saw that debate. I'm going to say this, and, everybody knows what side of the tracks I'm from. But after seeing that debate, there really shouldn't be any question who should be the next president of the United States. However you vote down ticket, I will encourage you to support people that would support this lady, the Vice President of the United States, Ms. Kamala Harris, to be president, and vote for people that will help her carry out her agenda in the Congress. And even in the states, right? But, if y'all really have a problem after watching that debate and seeing who is the person that should be the leader of the free world, then I don't know what else can convince you. I really don't. Now, it'll be her job to figure that out, to get you to come on over. But if I was undecided and I saw that, it would have been a no-brainer for me, because even if I wasn't a loyalist party-wise, I do have a value of the United States. I do have a value of the Constitution. I do have an incredible respect for the institutions of government. And that's why I personally put myself in a position to be a player in that. Regardless of how small a role I played, right? That would be the person I would want representing us on the world stage. The Vice President of the United States really put on a masterclass. And, I don't know if they're going to have another debate or not. And then, of course, the two vice presidential candidates will have a debate. And so we'll see if that trend continues, and maybe that might be the thing to swing you if the presidential debate didn't swing you. But that's just kind of my take on it, my short take on it, because, we got a packed show and I don't want to get too far, but there's also something else I want to talk about at the end. So, but I just wanted to offer my take on it. I think the vice president did an incredible job in making her case. And I think that when it's all said and done, she's going to be duly elected as the next president of the United States. All right. So I've said all that. Now let's go ahead and get our show started. And as always, we started off with a moment of news with Grace G.
Thanks, Eric. In a heated debate, Vice President Kamala Harris challenged Donald Trump on various issues, provoking an angry response from him while successfully shifting the focus onto his controversies. Pop star Taylor Swift, former Vice President Dick Cheney, and his daughter Liz Cheney endorsed Vice President Harris for the upcoming presidential election. A New York Times Siena College poll shows Donald Trump and Vice President Harris nearly tied in the presidential race, with Trump leading by 1 percentage point. A search is ongoing for a suspect in a shooting spree on a Kentucky interstate that injured 7 people. Colin Gray and his 14-year-old son appeared in a Georgia court facing serious charges after the Appalachia High School shooting. Hunter Biden pled guilty to federal charges, avoiding a trial just before the U.S. presidential election. The U.S. filed money laundering charges against 2 employees of a Russian news network for allegedly using a scheme to influence the 2024 presidential election. A judge delayed Donald Trump's sentencing in a hush money case until after the election to avoid perceptions of political bias. Trump's legal team appealed a $5 million verdict in a case involving E. Jean Carroll, arguing improper admission of testimony from other accusers. A federal court allowed California and Hawaii to enforce gun bans in certain public places. California Governor Gavin Newsom vetoed a bill allowing undocumented immigrants access to state home buying funds due to budget constraints. An ex-American Airlines mechanic was sentenced to 9 years for attempting to smuggle cocaine from Jamaica to New York. And American actor James Earl Jones, renowned for his powerful voice as Darth Vader and other iconic roles, passed away at the age of 93. I am Grace G., and this has been A Moment of News.
All right. Thank you, Grace, for that moment of news. And now it is time for my first guest, Fred Waitzkin. Fred Waitzkin was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts in 1943. He went to Kenyon College and did graduate study at New York University. He lives in Manhattan. His work has appeared in Esquire, New York Magazine, the New York Times Sunday Magazine, the New York Times Book Review, Outside, Sports Illustrated, Forbes, the Huffington Post, and the Daily Beast, among other publications. His memoir, Searching for Bobby Fischer, was made into a major motion picture released in 1993. His new book is a novel called Is Anything Good? And that's what we're going to be talking about on the podcast. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Fred Waitzkin. All right, Fred Waitzkin. Did I say that right?
You got it exactly right, Waitzkin.
All right, Fred Waitzkin, the legendary author, novelist, whatever title, writer, whatever title you want to use. I am really, really honored to have you as a guest on this podcast. Because you've written this book, and and I'm sitting up here. Anything is good. And, you just look at that in the bookstore and you're like going, anything, what direction is this going to go? Right. So before I get into the book title and what that means, what I normally like to do with a guest is that I throw out a quote, the kind of an icebreaker. So your quote is, I discovered that if you believe you are invisible, you really become invisible. What does that quote mean to you?
Well, I mean, what it means to me is it's something that my central character in the story says to himself at one point. If we talk about the story from the beginning, I want to talk about his early life, but when we get into the heart meat of the book, we're talking about a 20-year period of time where my central character is homeless. And at the beginning of his homeless, of this 20 years, I mean, he's scared to death, he's starving, he doesn't know where to get the food, he doesn't know where to get some clean water to drink, and he's afraid of getting beat up by people in the park. So he says to himself, what he learns is that if he tries to be invisible when he's sitting in the park and he's feeling danger around him, that he kind of becomes invisible. Sort of like when you look at a rabbit sometimes on your lawn or in the field. You'll notice he'll just sit very quietly, and you'll look at him and he'll look at you. And if you don't chase him, you'll maybe even forget that he's there. Or at least I think that's the intention of the rabbit. That is certainly the intention of my central character, Ralph. He feels that if he's very quiet and he pretends he's not there, that other people won't notice him. That's what it means.
All right, so let's get into the book. Anything is good. Why did you pick that title? What does that mean to you?
Well, I picked that title I picked that title when I got to the end of the book. So I think maybe if we tell our audience a little bit what happens in the book, then I'll tell you what the title means. I mean, if you want me to tell you now, I will, but it's sort of telling the end of the story before we tell the beginning. All
right. Well, that's fair. So, this is a book, and it's a friendship story in a way, but it really gets into this one particular character, Ralph Silverman. And Ralph spends a good portion of his adult life homeless. Why did you, first of all, who is Ralph to you? And why did you choose to write a story about a friend that was homeless? And what is, I guess, the tack on, what does homelessness mean to you as you tell this story through Ralph?
We'll go back from the beginning. Ralph was my best friend in high school, and he was the smartest kid in my high school. He was brilliant. He was a genius. He understood. I was interested in becoming a writer, and when I didn't understand what a poem meant, I asked Ralph, and he told me immediately. His mind was in all facets of intelligence. He was at a higher level, and we became very good friends. He was a strange guy in high school. I mean, he referred to himself as an alien, and I found that very interesting. I mean, it was as if he came from another planet. And he would tell me that, like, when he heard other kids in the school talking, in order to relate to them, it was like he was translating from a different language, and he would have to try to speak their language in order for them to understand him. So he was manifestly strange and very brilliant. We became very good friends. And when we finished high school, he went off to college in the Midwest, and he was recognized immediately as for having a brilliance in philosophy, academic philosophy. And even while he was still in college, he was doing philosophy at a very high level, and people were referring to him as a genius. And when he graduated from college, started a PhD program, but it was too slow for him, so he quit it, and he decided to study philosophy on his own. He was conferring with the greatest philosophers in the world, John Stuart Mill, Mill was one of his mentors, and 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 he was living in an apartment in the upper side of Manhattan, working on advanced philosophy and inventing things. He had a mind for inventions. He was inventing ways to make computers. This was sort of at the beginning of computers. He was inventing ways to make them faster, and he invented something called the Pythagorean, which was a kind of music that was based on one's brain waves. And if you listen to it, it makes you high as if you were smoking grass or hashish. And I have to go back a little bit more in the sense that when I was a kid, I didn't really know anything about his family. But later on, I learned that his father came to this country with very little money, but wanted to make money more than anything else, and he became involved with a gangster named Sammy the Bull Gravano, who some people have heard of because he was involved with John Gotti, and he's been accused of 19 murders. And he was Ralph's father's business partner, and the two of them, they owned 14 office buildings in Manhattan, really big ones, but they were undercapitalized. And while his father was doing this kind of dark work, Ralph was living in this apartment by himself, inventing. But the business started to fall apart at one point because the buildings were undercapitalized. So Ralph couldn't pay the rent in his apartment anymore. And his sister, who was also very intelligent, moved him to a tiny little house near Miami. And he lived in a room, was only large enough for a small bed and a little desk where he put his computer and he did his work. And the house was owned by a cousin, but they didn't get along at all. Cousin thought Ralph was crazy. And one night he came into his bedroom, he grabbed him by the collar and threw him out onto the street. Ralph wasn't wearing any shoes, he had no money in his pocket, and his glasses were broken. And he lived on the street for the next 20 years. That's how the story begins.
So, but what made you decide? Because it's you describe this. It comes out as a work of fiction, but it's really based off of a real person. So, what made you decide to fictionalize this story as opposed to just writing a biographical sketch of this homeless friend of yours?
Well, Eric, I think a lot of people don't realize it, but most good fiction is based on reality. When I talk about this subject, I often talk about Ernest Hemingway. The first novel that I read when I was 13 years old was The Old Man and the Sea, which I fell in love with. And I couldn't believe that he came up with such a great story, an old man going out by himself and fighting a fish that weighed 2,000 pounds, and then it gets eaten by sharks. It was such a great story. But I found out later, 15 years later, that 20 years before he wrote that novel, he met this guy in Cuba. His name was Santiago, who was the fisherman, who caught the fish. And he wrote a 2-page article in the Toronto Star summarizing what happened, the same story that he wrote about in the novel. This is true about a lot of great novels. A lot of people think fiction, you make it all up yourself. But most good fiction takes place initially in an event that took place with an author or with characters that he learned along the way, and then his fantasy takes over with those characters. And that's what I did with Ralph.
So, you dive into the world through Ralph. You dive into this world of being homeless. And as somebody who was reading that, it was just like the way things happened, this domino effect about this thing and this thing. It was like 1 minute, this guy was, pursuing his dream and, living, I wouldn't say an affluent life, but he was living a good life. He didn't have any worries. He could put his focus on what he wanted. And then in a matter of moments, he was on a park bench in Miami, Florida, Miami Beach. Right. What does that say to you about the condition of homelessness, and especially as we are approaching, well, as we are in the middle of an election year, why is the issue of homelessness important?
Well, it's all around us. I mean, it's all around us, except it's easy not to notice it. I mean, I live in New York City, and from what I read, there's about 200,000 homeless people living in the city. But before I started doing the research for this book, I mean, the homeless people in the city were part of the furniture of the city. I mean, I'd walk down the street, there'd be guys leaning against the light pole, or he'd be lying on the concrete. My office is on 28th Street, which is the flower district of Manhattan. And, you know, you walk past all these beautiful flower stores, but lying on the concrete in front of the flower stores are men and women without, some of them without clothes, lying on the concrete without a pillow, maybe on a box. But it just sort of blends into the life, and you don't think of it after a while. So you just, you know, you think, as I said before, you think of these people almost like the furniture of the city. But once I started investigating the story and learning about Ralph, I started seeing the homeless people in the city and everywhere that I live in different terms. I mean, I started to see that there are brilliant people in the city that are homeless, and they're caring people that are homeless, and they're creative people that are homeless. There are also bad people that are homeless that might do bad things. But I had a whole different vision of the problem and the reality of who is homeless from the research that I started doing on this book before I wrote it and while I was writing.
So I've lived in 3 cities in my life. I grew up in Chicago. I spent the majority of my life in Jackson, Mississippi, and now I'm in Atlanta. And my next question is based off of a personal experience with me. So I've been also very fortunate to travel this country. And the most striking image to me out of all of the homelessness I have seen and experienced was going to Washington, D.C. And it seemed like every green space in Washington, D.C. had homeless folks. And the most striking was there's a park right across where the Department of Veteran Affairs is in D.C. And you see this big, beautiful white building, and it's got the sign, veterans, and then you look at this park and you see all these homeless people, and a lot of them had their military uniforms that they were issued and kept. And they were sleeping in this park right across from the agency that's supposed to be taking care of them.
Right.
Out of doing your research, what was the most striking thing that you saw, and what do you think can be done to fix that problem that you saw?
Well, you know, I saw many manifestations of homelessness that were crushing. You know, one example that I could give you is there's a lady. I live in Manhattan, and in front of my house is a little park, and it was newly renovated, maybe 12 or 14 park benches, and it's a beautiful place where mommies and babies come with strollers. They come through, and little kids learn to play football, baseball there. It's just a little park, but very, very beautiful. But about 2 years ago, a woman immigrated to the park and started living on a bench, one of the benches. And she had a husband. They were living on the bench together. And for 2 years, they lived on the bench. They lived on the bench in the snow. They lived on the bench in the rain. They covered themselves with a blanket. They got drenched when it was raining. They hardly ever moved off the bench. They probably went to the bathroom some of the time on the bench. Last winter, the husband froze to death on the bench. He died. And the lady kept living there. There are a couple of ladies in my neighborhood that kind of take care of them. Sherry and Jenny, they watch out for her. But when you spend time with her, and I have spent time with her, you realize that she doesn't know where to go. The bench is her only life, and she doesn't know she doesn't want to go into a a place that homeless people can live because she's afraid of getting robbed or hurt. And so I watched her for a while, and then I started to not think about her again. In other words, I started to think about her as part of the furniture of the place. But then one night I was coming home, and she was sitting on the bench, and she was sitting up. She wasn't lying down. She didn't have the blanket over her head. And there was a young man who was a painter or an artist of some sort, and he was sitting next to her on the bench. And I kind of moved close to them, and I started listening. And he had a portfolio of drawings, and they looked really good, the drawings he was doing. And he was turning the pages to her. She was looking at the drawings and making suggestions on the drawings like an art teacher, saying, this would be better if this was darker. This would be, you could have brought this up. This is a little... She was directing him. And I was blown away, because here was this woman that had been living on the bench in front of my house for 2 years, and I'd sort of taken for granted her craziness, her eccentricity, the fact that she groomed herself on the bench, that she ate on the beach. But here, this one night, this actually happened like only 2 weeks ago, she was very wise in the direction of art. She obviously had a background in art. So what does this tell me? What this tells me is that all sorts of people are homeless. My friend Ralph was homeless. I mean, Ralph was a genius, is a genius. He's a genius. He lived on a park bench for nearly 20 years. So I think that, first of all, I mean, what it teaches is that homeless people are not inferior, or I'm repeating myself. They're not part of the furniture of the city. They're people with feelings and depth and intelligence, but we just don't see them that way. It's not convenient for us to look at them that way. Now, like in the book, for example, Ralph meets remarkable people in his homeless life. At one point, he immigrates from Miami Beach up to Pompano Beach, and there's a park that he stays in there. And he meets this one woman, her name is Melanie. And Melanie has been living on the street for 15 years. She has a lover, his name is Wayne. He's a tough guy, kind of keeps order in the park. But Melanie was a computer expert. She took apart mainframe Texas computers and put them together. She was a sage in computers. She earned a lot of money before she lost her job temporarily and then fell in love with Wayne. And Ralph started talking computers with Melanie, and Ralph was really smart with computers, but she knew computers better than he did. So there you go. That's one story. Another thing that I learned, which I thought was very interesting, it speaks to your point. In homeless parks, very often you'll have visitors from the outside world that will go into the park because they want to have a dialogue with a couple of people in the park. Because in these parks, almost invariably, there are one or two or three people that are sages that really have learned so much from living on the street that they have a deeper intelligence, and they're not fettered with a lot of the superficial value stuff that most of us have because we're fortunate not to live on the street, And that people actually come to the park to learn from the homeless people because there's a certain refreshing way in which they look at the world. So that's another example of what you're speaking about, I think.
Yeah, and there's a song. I don't know if you're familiar with this group, Arrested Development, but they had a song called Mr. Wendell. And the gist of that story was the artist is telling the story about this homeless guy who was smarter than anybody he had ever encountered, and it was kind of like an homage to Mr. Wendell. Like, you go ahead, Mr. Wendell. That's like part of the chorus. It's like, I respect you for the human being you are, even though other people might look at you different because you're homeless, right? Yeah. And the character Ralph, there was a guy in Jackson, Mississippi, who was homeless by choice. His son went to college, he went to a private boarding school, And that's how I got to know the relationship between, I had known this young man's father from a distance. I got to know him more intimately because I worked at that school when his son was there. And then his son went on to University of Mississippi, basketball scholarship. He's a coach and all that. But his dad is homeless on his own accord. And he has taken that role, or he had taken that role to advocate for the homeless. And in Ralph, there was a certain point where you have people from the park coming to him and asking him for advice and basically kind of telling their life story to him. And it reminded me of him. And in a sense, Ralph kind of took on that role of being not necessarily an advocate for him, but being a counselor. And so that kind of highlights what you're talking about the sage. You know, you have these people that everybody respects. And why did you feel that was important to highlight that aspect of Ralph's experience?
Well, because Ralph was a sage before he went into the park, and he was definitely a sage after the first few years when he got his legs underneath him and he learned how to live in the park. He was definitely a sage. He was sought out by other people, you know, to give them comfort, to talk to them like a lay psychologist. And interestingly enough, when Ralph was in the park, I would call him from time to time. Or rather, he would call me, collect in New York. And I would almost always ask him, do you want to leave the park, man? Do you want to, you know, is it time to come back into the real world? You know, or the world that's not the underworld? And he'd say, no, I like living this way. I like living this way. There's a rawness to it and aliveness to it, very much like the friend that you were talking about before. For a number of years, he didn't want to leave the park. Eventually, one day he called me up and he said, Fred, if I don't get out of the park, I'm going to die. I know it. And then I went down to Florida and helped him get out of the park. But for many years, he did not want to leave the park.
Yeah. So homelessness has been a part of our literary culture forever. I mean, it's in the Bible, right? Why do you think we are fascinated in a literary sense, in a cultural sense with homelessness? And how come, in your opinion, does it not translate into action that needs to be done in a political or a policy sense?
Well, I think they're two separate questions.
Okay.
I mean, well, I was speaking to you earlier about reading Ernest Hemingway when I was 12 or 13 years old, and when I was 16 years old, I was reading Jack Kerouac. Jack Kerouac was a great influence on me as a writer because the characters that he wrote about, you know, he was living in the hills in California. He was hitchhiking across the country. He was basically a homeless person, and not entirely. And towards the end of his career, he was famous and he was making some money. But basically, he was a homeless person. He was living outside in the rain. He was feeling the essence of life without the accoutrements of life, without glamour, without fancy restaurants, without fancy cars. And I think that's one of the reasons why he was so attractive to many readers, because he actually tasted the rawness of life. And then, of course, he was a good writer, a great writer, and he was able to show it to us. I think that in the same way that I just described a few minutes ago, that some people go to parks to speak to homeless people because they're looking for the same thing that Jack Kerouac gave us in his writing, a kind of elemental. I mean, there's so much goop in life. There's so much comfort in life that very often you don't feel the basic things in life. You don't feel what it's like to be outside, you know, when the summer is turning to fall, and you can smell the fall and smell the fall leaves. If you're homeless, you experience those things because that's where you live. That's who you live with. What was the second part of your question again?
So that fascination has not led to well, I wouldn't say not led to activism, but it hasn't led to any kind of concrete policy to address the issue or something that can build consensus. we're fascinated, as the term you use, the furniture of the park or the furniture of the society. And we'll read books and all this stuff, but it hasn't translated to addressing the issue where we minimize or eliminate it altogether.
I think so many people are in love with making a lot of money and living rich. I mean, you know, our ex-president wouldn't see anything beautiful about the writing of Jack Kerouac, and he wouldn't see anything beautiful about the way the homeless people live. You have to look deeply and carefully and slowly to see the greatness of many great people. Now, the question of the problem, what to do about it, I can't answer that question. I know that some people are struggling to do it. I read recently that the governor of California built a kind of residence apartment house for homeless people, for 67 homeless families, but the cost of it was $680,000 a unit. So how are we going to take care of millions of homeless people at those kind of prices? I mean, it's a very, very big problem. It would take a different kind of my talent in the world is to depict a room so that one gets the feeling of the room. Sometimes the political answer is not so obvious to me. The answer isn't obvious to me.
Yeah, one of the things in my mind, because being a former elected official, I was just thinking, isn't it ironic that Ralph's father had this big giant place that he couldn't use or he couldn't rent out, and his son, along with thousands of other people, are sitting without a place to stay? Wouldn't it have been something if Isaac's big warehouse became a place where homeless people could live and be safe and have some, as you say, accoutrements? But that's how my mind works. You know what I'm saying? I said, wouldn't it have been something? That'd have been an interesting twist to the story. You know what I'm saying? But that, like I said, that's how my mind works. And that's not what really happened. So, let me ask you this as we kind of close out. This is the 7th novel that you've written.
Yes.
And you've been doing this for over 50 years. Was there something different that you brought to this particular creative process in writing this book as opposed to the other books that you've written?
There was. It was kind of a mystical experience. You know, I'd gotten to about two-thirds the way through the writing of the book, and I thought it was an important story. I thought it was a story that people had to know about, because it hasn't. I mean, there have been a couple of great books written about homelessness, but not many, and not. I don't think anything that captures the present situation of homeless people. And I didn't know how to end the book, and I was feeling sad and depressed about it. And one night, you know, I fell asleep. I woke up in the morning. I was still half asleep, and I had a vision. And I always keep a little writing pad behind my bed. And I sat down and I wrote a half a page. And I knew what to do when I went to my office that day. And I sat down at my computer and I started to write the end of the book. Then for the next 4 months, every night I either had a dream falling asleep or a dream waking up about what to write next. So the last 25% of the book was a dream vision, a pure dream vision. It had never happened to me before, and I hope it happens again. But the ending, I think, of the book is very arresting. It's a very interesting and positive switch to the story, and it came to me in a series of dreams.
Yeah, it's very, very compelling, man. And of course, you've been doing this for a long time, so people that have been that are fans of yours would not be surprised of it. But I really, really appreciated the detail that you put in and how easy you could immerse yourself in that world. It was very, 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 very well done. So what I usually do at the end is encourage people to buy the book. So how can people get it? How can people reach out to you to talk about the book or other things Yeah, just let people know how people get the book and get in touch with you.
I have a website, fredwaitzkin.com, and I can be reached by my website. I'm interested in hearing from fans and answering questions. You can also reach me on Amazon. But I think the best way to buy the book is through Barnes & Noble or Amazon. The book is available either in a Kindle or a hardcover version. Amazon very often offers the book at discount, give good discounts. And I love to hear from readers. Drop me a note if you read the book. It'll be great to hear from you.
Well, Fred Waitzkin, it's an honor again to state again. It's an honor to have you on. One of the cool things about having a podcast is being able to meet great people like you. And I am glad that you used your literary skills to address this particular issue. And hopefully, this will add to the conversation and make people more sensitive about it and lead to some positive actions to address it. So thank you again for coming on.
Eric, you're a soulful guy. I enjoyed our talk. I really did.
Thank you, sir. All right, guys, and we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. And so now it is time for my next guest. And his name is Matthew Ferrence. Matthew Ferrence lives and writes at the confluence of Appalachia and the Rust Belt. He teaches creative writing at Allegheny College in Meadville, Pennsylvania. He is the author of I Hate It Here, Please Vote for Me, Essays on Rural Political Decay. And that's the book we're going to be talking about during the interview. So, ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct honor and privilege to have as a guest on this podcast, Matthew Ferrence. All right, Matthew Ferrence. How you doing, sir? You doing good?
Yeah, doing well. We got beautiful autumn happening, and yeah, we'll go with that. You doing well?
I'm doing good, man. I'm just happy to be here, and I'm really excited to talk to you because you chronicled a journey. The name of the book is called I Hate It Here, Please Vote for Me, Essays on Rural Political Decay. So
that's it.
You wrote about your experience about running for office. And so that was very fascinating to me. And I wanted to talk to you about this book and that experience. But before we get started, what I like to do is throw out a quote, kind of an icebreaker. So your quote is, cries and whispers, a bang or a whimper. Whatever the case, if we want to be heard, we must raise our voice or lower it. What does that quote mean to you?
Yeah, so that's from Mary Ruffle, and that's the kind of dedication quote for the book. And there's two important things there. I'll start with the last one, and that's the lowering our voice. And when I hear that, what I think of is the best friends or the best writers, quoting a different writer, Patricia Hampel here, they put their arm around your shoulder, and they invite you into their life, and they speak softly in your ear about what it is to be them. And that's one of the most powerful forces for social change and political change. And that's what I think poetry and writing do in the political context, which might be a little bit funny to think about. But then the other part is making our voices heard. What I'm writing about is running as a progressive Democrat in an extremely right-wing district and the unsurprising outcome of losing, but trying to get at what we're really losing when voices like that are washed away. So we have to raise our voices when we are thought to not exist in certain places, because that's the other way we can affect change that might make the world a better place.
All right. So you're a creative writing professor.
Yeah.
At And what's the name of the college?
It's Allegheny College. It's a small undergraduate college up in the little extra rectangle on the top of Pennsylvania in the northwest on Lake Erie.
Okay. And so that means you're not a career politician like me.
Right.
So what was the office that you ran in 2020, right?
Correct. Yeah. So I ran for our Pennsylvania House of Representatives, so
Okay.
State House of Representatives, and Pennsylvania is I think it's the second largest legislature in the country. It's a full-time legislature with a lot of people, a lot of districts, and I decided that I wanted to throw my hat in the ring for important and petty reasons both.
Well, talk about that. What was the important and petty reasons why you wanted to run?
Well, they're the same reason, which is kind of fun. The petty started, the person who's been in that seat for a really long time in, I can't remember if it was 2016 or 2017 off the top of my head here. But he said that he thought that the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania should save some money by stopping financial aid for college for any student who, quoting him, studies poetry or any other pre-Walmart major. And that got me going as a professor of pre-Walmart studies in his context. Like that was an attack on what I do and what my students do. But then the non-petty, so I was just angry, right? So the non-petty part of it is, for me, what's underneath that line is the assumption that if you grow up in a certain place and are a certain kind of person, you cannot choose your own destiny, that you only exist to work in the terms of what someone else has decided the economy is. So it's a curtailing of horizons and dreams. And what's often told to people who grow up in poverty or people who grow up in rural spaces is that, or both, their only use is as labor to provide money for other people to get wealthy on. And there's no point in being a poet in, I guess in this context, unless you're wealthy, because it's a, quote, useless sort of thing. And then he also later apologized to Walmart for that comment, which also was an indication that he was much more interested in, or is much more interested in, the support of a large big box company that has decimated small businesses in rural places than actually representing the hopes and dreams of the people around him. And so that's what I based my campaign on conceptually.
Well, and you bring up an interesting point, because I remember I spent most of my life in Mississippi. I grew up in Chicago, which basically I tell people why I'm a Democrat, because my precinct captain was my Little League coach. So it was like, from birth, it was pretty much understood I was going to be a Democrat. Then I go to college in Mississippi and end up staying there like 30-some years. And then now I'm here in Atlanta. But during the time I was in Mississippi is when I got, politically active and got elected, all that. So there was a candidate I worked for who was running for Congress. And his claim to fame, he owned a funeral home in this town. And his claim to fame was that when Walmart came to his town, they were, entertaining coming, and he stood up at the Chamber of Commerce meeting and was like, hell no, they can't come. It's like, it's going to kill all the businesses and all that. And everybody said, well, you've got a business that Walmart can't take away. So it's like, who are you to tell us what it's going to do? And sure enough, when Walmart came, a lot of those businesses over time started closing and stuff. And so, just that was like in 1988.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that dynamic has been around, and it's still kind of a thing. And then in the city that I lived in Jackson, they had built like this Walmart and by the campus, and they had the first Sam's Club in Mississippi was right next door. And then when they decided to build something brand new, they just abandoned it. And so it took forever to get somebody else in that property to do anything with it. So, ironically, the pastor of the church I went to was the guy who ended up buying the building.
Oh, interesting.
And so he moved his church into that, what used to be, because it was a grocery store attached to it too. So he just moved the church all in there. Yeah. So you had a platform. So talk about the platform, but there was really, and you kind of touched on a little bit, but there was really an underlying reason for running other than the platform, right? Because in the platform, you've got these talking points: healthcare, education, better highways, whatever we run on, put on a little push card or whatever. So what was that platform? And then, but what was really the gut of why you were running? Why was it significant for those particular items for you to run on?
Yeah. So my platform, the number one was healthcare, and it was really talking about single payer healthcare. There has been for a long time a plan, more than a concept of a plan, but an actual plan that's been developed for the state. The state's large enough that it could become a single payer. And what I learned as I was researching, as I was running, is that it would keep the same or lower the cost for greater than 90% of Pennsylvanians. So that was a primary thing. And this will get to the underlying motivations as well. Then public education investment in that, and environmental protection. And I knew, right, that these are obviously instantaneously recognizable as democratic or even lefty democratic values. But the county that I live in ranks in the bottom third of per capita income in Pennsylvania. And the city that I live in has about a 1/3 poverty rate. So it's a high poverty area. And there are huge problems of access to healthcare if we just look at that one. Our hospital, we're lucky we still have a privately owned hospital, but the greater bulk of their service is for people who don't actually have insurance. And so they have to use Medicaid. That creates financial pressures for the hospital as well. But essentially what I'm looking at are people are struggling, and they've been struggling for a long time. And one of the things that holds them captive to that struggle is, say they have a really bad job, but whatever, they've got health care. They're not going to quit that job. So we actually open up opportunities for entrepreneurship. We open up opportunities to leave a bad boss, for going where you want to live, maybe living in a rural space if you're not yoked to employer-sponsored health care. And in my own case, I had a brain tumor, surgery and radiation in 2016, and I have good insurance. And it probably was last year that we finally paid off the debt that we accrued based on that. And I knew, doing the numbers myself, my family would save like $8,000 a year in a single payer system. Even though, quote, taxes would go up, our actual costs would go down. That contrasts with the perpetual platform of the person that I ran against, which reduces to exactly what you would expect for kind of a low interest right-wing GOP, no taxes. That's like his main thing. There should be no taxes. He's proud he's never voted for a tax increase without nuance. And then he's, quote, pro-life and pro-gun. And what I would say is the taxes thing is hurting the district, and the other two are not helping the district. They're just, they're what make people fight with politicians. So that was the kind of lack of representation in a place that has continued to struggle since industry started leaving in the 1950s, that we need political policy answers to help alleviate the suffering. And it's not just getting rid of taxes, because when you can't afford your health care, it doesn't matter.
So my dad told me years after I stopped running for office, he said he was amazed that I even got into politics, because he said, one, you're a natural introvert, and two, you have a low tolerance for BS, right? Yeah. You're actually allergic to it. And so he was amazed that not only did I get in, but I was somewhat successful.
Yeah.
So my question to you is, are you allergic to BS? And if you are, how did you navigate dealing with that in order to run for office?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm actually, I call myself a gregarious introvert. So also it doesn't make sense for me to get into politics. But yeah, I have no tolerance for BS. And more than that, I have no tolerance for exploitation and unfairness. And so what I tried to do as a candidate, and it was hard because this was a COVID candidacy, so I had to do almost all of my campaigning online. And what I would do every Monday, called it Mondays with Matt, and I would do sketch sessions where I'd stick my camera on a big pad of paper and I would sketch cartoons and I would talk about issues. And for me, it was about storytelling, where let's start with no taxes, no tax increase ever, and let's get at the story that creates the BS of that. And healthcare is a perfect example, is that to pay for single payer healthcare, absolutely, you do need additional tax, except that costs you less than the tax you already pay to your healthcare provider. That's not a tax because it's not represented. So that was what I tried to do to cut through the BS, is hit all of the stories that circulate and we just accept to be true. What does it mean to be a Republican? What does it mean to be a Democrat? Most people aren't thinking about this, and so they're very susceptible to the stories that keep recirculating. And that was my my BSometer and my anti-BS attempts, was to explain where they came from, what the history is to that, and what the actual reality could be on the ground if we refuse to just say, oh, I've always voted for Republicans, pull the lever. And in the same case, always voted for Democrats and pull the lever. If you're not thinking about what they're doing, then you're not really voting for anything other than a false idea.
So what did you learn about your district or Americans in general in this process of running for office?
Yeah. So some of it was kind of confirmation of inklings. But one great recognition that I didn't fully realize was, so I got blown out in this election, 65-35, which is basically the registration split. But that meant at the ballot box, 12,000 people in a district of 67,000 people, 12,000 of them voted for me. And in the campaign and in that, it was the recognition that even though it's a big red map where I live, there are a lot of people who are not there. And that really helped me understand where I lived even more, and where I've always lived in places like this. And the problem of our national politics, making it a binary. It's a red state, it's a blue state or county or whatever. That was one of the eye-opening things. The other thing that I think this would be in the category of, I kind of knew this was happening, but I saw it in a much more visceral way, was Republicans don't have to try very hard in a place like Crawford County, Pennsylvania, because since the Republican Party was invented, they've always voted for Republicans, almost without exception. But it became really clear to me that the Democratic Party statewide and nationally is also not interested in the district because they've given up on the votes. And so, and in some ways, like, that's politics, that's strategy. It's not worth their money, but that helped me understand the divide we have, is that we're not trying to help people understand how it could be different, because you don't have political discourse happening. That's the thing that I take away as the greatest value of having run, was to put a voice out there that wasn't trying to modulate and say, oh, I'm just like the Republicans, vote for me. Saying, no, there's a different way of thinking, and I represent these 12,000 people and more who aren't getting what they need. And I would say very few people are getting what they need in districts like mine.
Yeah, and, you know, that was one of the reasons why I kind of liked Howard Dean when he was the chair of the Democratic Party. Because Howard's mentality was, if you are a state in the union, then we're going to compete in it. And now, when it came down to the local stuff, like in your situation, now the Democrats would put their money in Philadelphia, put their money in Pittsburgh, maybe a little money in Harrisburg, but every place else, you know, we just want to get enough votes to offset whatever else was going to happen. But he was still campaigning. I mean, he came to Mississippi when I ran for the U.S. Senate and all that stuff. And then the other thing I wanted to highlight was when you talked about those 12,000, I remember I'd said something either in a speech or something online, because online was kind of new at that point. It's like Facebook or whatever. Because literally somebody not from Mississippi created my social media pages. And just gave me the password and said, have fun. But I posted something that said that I was a blue dot in a red sea called Mississippi. And so the responses I get, well, I'm a blue dot too. I'm a blue dot too. So we had T-shirts with my logo on there and had a blue dot on there. Yeah. And so people were gravitating to that. And, I got beat when I ran for the U.S. Senate, the last time. This was in 2008. And, cause I ran in 2006 as well. And so I got like maybe 38% of the vote statewide, but it was more numerical votes than ever any black candidate had ever gotten at that time statewide. So it was like, it sent because people actually thought I was going to win. It was kind of crazy because that was the Obama year and everybody was geeked up and stuff. And I'm thinking, really, I mean, people were sending me resumes. NPR was trying to book me for that Wednesday after election. I mean, it was crazy. Yeah. But when you put yourself out there and you put yourself out there in a credible way, you're putting, like you said, that voice out there. And I think that's very, very important. And what really impressed me about your writing was that you were talking about how important it is to have that voice in rural America. So kind of expound on that, because that's really how you kick the book off and talking about why rural America is what it is and why it shouldn't be ignored.
Yeah. Well, I love the blue dot in the Red Sea, and the power of what you did and the power of what I was trying to do is helping blue dots see each other, because when you're lost and you're by yourself, you don't actually recognize how much potential collective power you have. And 38 bigger numbers, right? It's still a loss, but the blue dots are like, hey, wait a minute. There's more of us than we thought. So yeah, like I grew up in rural America. That's to answer your question more directly. I'm an essayist, so nothing's direct. It's all a wandering back to a point at some point.
But you're very good at it, so that's why it's okay.
Thank you. So I grew up on a farm. It was not a full-time farm, but we were an active farm. I was in 4-H as a kid, showed goats at the county fair, grew up as a hunter, all of the markers that you're, quote, supposed to have as a rural kid. But I also grew up playing the saxophone and being in musicals at school and a good student. And my dad was simultaneously, he's a first-generation college student, but he was also a college professor. He taught environmental biology, and he's a Republican, kind of like an old Eisenhower Republican. And so who I am now, and this is a lot of what this book is about, the memoir aspect of it, who I am now as a progressive rural person is not what people would think is someone moved out of Chicago, right? You mentioned Chicago, and now they've come to the countryside, and they're bringing those big city values, whatever that means. My values came from the farm. My values came from growing up in a rural place. My values came from growing up in a town that was abandoned by coal companies in the 1970s. And that's the storytelling part that is so important, that you're not a weirdo well, maybe you are. You're not necessarily a weirdo. I'm a weirdo is what I'm saying. You're not a weirdo if you come from a place like this and you have these values. One of the things that's been most meaningful to me about this book was really personified last week. I did a reading for the hometown at the college, and I got some emails from students I didn't know and students that came up to me who were saying, I grew up in a rural place too, and I was made to feel like I had to leave and I could never go back. And it's so nice to hear somebody else saying there's a place for me. And as one of them said, same thing I argue, that's who I am. I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, and I don't feel right anywhere else. And that's what's not right about being made an exile in the place that made you and you're part of. And that's both politics and not. And it's gratifying, that blue dot connecting to the larger sea, for other people, particularly younger people, to recognize, I don't have to abandon my home because of who I am. Maybe it's not just worth fighting for, but maybe it's a fight that we can make headway in.
Yeah, and the other thing that really kind of impressed me was the 2 hours, right? Because you talk about that you were only from the district where you're running in and that you live in, you grew up only 2 hours away, but you were talking about how you were made an outsider. And I remember when there was this guy named Kirk Fordyce who was from Tennessee, and he went to Purdue University, and he was a Republican. He was like a president of the Associated General Contractors at one time, the national president. So he decided to run for governor of Mississippi because he had established a company in Vicksburg. He was running against an incumbent governor who was a Democrat. The only time that guy left the state was to serve his country in the Navy. And he came back and became like the state auditor and then became the governor and all that stuff. And now he's been like the Secretary of Navy, under some Democratic presidents. But his godfather was a former governor of the state. Yeah. And this Republican guy who was not born in Mississippi, who just set up shop to literally throw rocks in the Mississippi River. That's they call it ballast and all that, but that was basically his job, was concrete slabs in the river. He had a contract to do that. He painted this incumbent governor as an outsider and won. And it was basically not about the background, but it was about the quote unquote values, the agenda. And that's one of the things you had to fight. It was like, I didn't grow up in this particular part of Western Pennsylvania, but I grew up in Western Pennsylvania. And I understand what's going on. My viewpoint is we can do better. Why was that? Why do you feel that was challenging to people to accept it?
Yeah, well, I think that's what comes. Your story is the exact example of it. Is that the dominating idea of what counts as local has nothing to do with actual locality. It has everything to do with a powerful group decides what is from that place, and then anything else is painted as outside. We're seeing that in a huge way. Just right now, it's not too long after the debate between Kamala and somebody else, and the painting, the xenophobia, and the painting of monstrosity of immigrants to Ohio, which is not that far from where I am, is the same thing. It's a way to, in a grotesque and amazingly harmful way, to define people who come and invest in a place as never being allowed to not only be from there, but to be considered human in a place like that. I didn't have to suffer the depth of that, though I was Stalin to my opponents, and I was buddies with Nancy Pelosi to my opponents. All of these tropes come out, but that's how that definition of locality is weaponized. But that 2 hours away that I write about goes also in another direction, and that's part of what I explore. Is there's the insult of, well, you're not from here, you grew up 2 hours away, and I would say in a county exactly the same as this one. But then there's also people who have values like me who live here who would say, oh, it's only 2 hours to civilization from here. It's only 2 hours to Pittsburgh. It's only 2 hours to Cleveland. And that's part of the challenge I'm trying to put also, is that progressively minded and liberal folks in rural places have to try to work beyond their assumptions that they never want to become localized to rural spaces. Is that for them, the escape to the city is the only way they can live in a place like here. And that allows the insult of you're not from here to have purchase, because they're accepting in a certain way that this can't be their home. And I care a lot about geography and like being embedded in landscape. And the essayist Scott Russell Sanders writes about this, having grown up in Ohio, moved around in a military family, and then rooting himself in the state of Indiana once he moved there, and growing roots as, using the metaphor of the transplant to become part of that social artistic community, and we have to all allow that to happen. Otherwise, we're going to get the weirdness of locality that we have. Actually, a quick sidelight here is that I always think about this. US 6 goes through our county, and US 6 is the Grand Army of the Republic Highway. So it's named after the Union veterans of the Civil War. And there's sort of a throwback to, if my history's right, Pennsylvania was a Union state.
Yeah.
But all along PA 6 now, you'll see Confederate battle flags.
Mm.
And it's such an inversion of what, and that's like, okay, big quotes here, because it's, local values. It's not local values at all. It's actually completely inverting what it meant to be a Pennsylvanian who fought in the Civil War and what they fought for. But somehow that's been perverted into, quote, down-home values. And that's what people have to be working against, because, there's obviously very specific real harm that comes from that.
Yeah. I get the irony and all that as well. So you come from a state where you have two very high profile U.S. senators.
Yeah.
John Fetterman, Bob Casey. President Biden was born there in Pennsylvania. Is there anybody in the current political landscape that either locally or nationally that kind of fits in and that you really respect and admire how they've campaigned or how they represented their area?
Yeah, and I'm going to go to Pennsylvania, and it's a current member of the Pennsylvania House who is running for state auditor general, and I just met him in person last weekend. And he's from Philadelphia. Now, it's really important to this story. And we're as far away from Philadelphia as you can get in the Commonwealth. And he was at our spring breakfast for the, whatever small number of Democrats were there. And that's Malcolm Kenyatta, who's running for state auditor general. And he has spoken about and recognizes in a very real way that he needs to be present and wants to be present in every part of the county authentically, because he doesn't want to be discarded by a rural voter as somebody from Philadelphia. But he's a brilliant speaker. I can't help but tell another story here. So the breakfast was at a place called the Baldwin Reynolds House here in town. It's owned by our historical society, and it's an old mansion that was built in the style of a Southern plantation home, which is very strange in the snow belt of northwestern Pennsylvania, just from how cold you're going to be in the winter standpoint. But it was built by a former justice of the Supreme Court, Baldwin. And Baldwin was going to move here. And Baldwin's claim to fame, infame, is that he was the lone dissenting vote in the Amistad case. And so that's why he was building a plantation house here. He got sick and never lived here, so karma hit him. And Malcolm Kenyatta referenced that in his speech to say that, he's here, but his friends are like, you're going to an old mansion in northwestern Pennsylvania? Do we need to check on you? And he said, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, there was no way I would have been welcomed here. But he's working to demonstrate that there is nothing strange or incendiary about supporting him when you come from a rural place. And he's going to be there. He's going to put himself on the line to visit. And his resources of time, he's not going to get that many votes in Crawford County, but whatever he's going to get is part of that work. So in the future, and I think he has a very bright political future because he's very, he's just the most impressive politician, honestly, I've ever met. I think we're going to see more of him, and part of it is because he's actually invested in making the visit and not pandering. He could have pretended, oh, it's so wonderful to be here and there's nothing different about it. It's like, hey, I'm a young gay black man in a town that is in a county that probably doesn't want me here in a majority way. And I have so much respect for that.
Yeah, and he's one of the few state legislators that has a national profile.
Right.
And he is very impressive. But But it just reminds me when I ran for U.S. Senate, there is a town in Mississippi called Stonewall. And I was speaking in another city, and there was this lady, white lady, who was running for judge, and she came from Stonewall, and she said, I need you to come to my town to campaign. And I said, well, sure. I was anywhere, everywhere in the state, all 82 counties I was going. So when I get there, it's like she was actually having a fundraiser. And so she wanted me to speak at her fundraiser. And it was like this old mill that they have repurposed into like, kind of like a mall or whatever. They had like individual shops and all that stuff. So anyway, I get there, the local newspaper's there, it's white folks, it's black folks. I mean, it was just like an incredible crowd. And, I'm thinking, well, wow, she's got a lot of support, but they were coming for me because one of the older residents said nobody that had ever run for the United States Senate has ever physically shown up here to ask for our vote. And so it was like a big deal, so it was like, can you take pictures with us and all this stuff? And I felt bad that I didn't win because it's like, now those pictures don't mean nothing. But but the power of physically going to places where, quote unquote, you're not supposed to win or anything like that is the essence of retail politics. And so it's very refreshing to hear somebody in this day and age, like you said, where they target particular areas and say, okay, we're going to go there and we're not going to waste our resources here. That's refreshing to me that there's somebody, especially a young person like him, that understands the value of retail politics.
Yeah.
So
and there were some other. Oh, sorry. Well, yeah. Go ahead.
No. Well, go ahead. Finish.
Well, it's really fast. There were some other statewide candidates who sent surrogates with the excuse that, well, it's a tight race. They have to raise money elsewhere, and that's the polarity. That's the difference right there. Is like, yeah, okay, but that means you're not here. That means you don't actually care about us. Yeah.
That surrogate stuff. Not that I had the money to do it, but it was like, no, the people want to see who they voting for. Because one quick funny story before I get to my last question for you. I remember I went to speak to the Brotherhood of Elks. I don't know if you ever heard of that group.
Yeah.
But they had their state convention in Tupelo, Mississippi. And so when you see my name, the way it's spelled, most of the folks thought, well, it's some white guy I don't know or whatever, but he's coming to speak. So it was like, okay, fine. So when they saw me and then they heard me speak and do all this stuff, it was like the folks were coming up to me and say, boy, I'm sure glad you showed up because we thought you was some white guy. You know what I'm saying? Running, and we were trying to figure out how this white guy even knew about the Elks, let alone spoke to the group. So it was like that made a difference. So of course, then it's like, hey y'all, there's a black guy running for this seat. You know what I'm saying? And that kind of spread. So the more that you're exposed, the better you are. So the last question is, well, let me combine it. One, for a personal thing, do you think you'll ever run for office again? And two, why do you think more people don't run for public office?
Well, and the answer to one is related to number two. I don't intend to, and that's mostly a personal decision and a family decision because it's really hard on people, not just the time expended, but the mental anguish of running in the context of hatred that prevails. And I think that's why more people of integrity don't run, because there's so much toxicity, particularly when you're running against the dominant strain wherever you are. You're going to get abused. And that's a problem that I have no easy solution for in the United States. That said, writing this book, telling stories, I see as an extension of a political campaign. In some ways, I'm hopeful that I can have even a greater impact on the discourse of politics through writing than I could even if I had won and then get mired in the position of being in the House, where you have to do the very difficult work of legislation. But yeah, it's just, I can take anything, but my family is too empathetic, right? Like it's too hard, or there were real perceptions of fear and threat that happen when you run in a place like where I ran, as I ran, and I couldn't do that to other people. And it pains me to say that that's a case, but that's true across the country. There's a lot of people that it would be far riskier for them to step into the arena than it would be for me, and I don't blame anybody for not doing it.
Well, Matthew, your book is very, very timely, and I would like for as many people to get a hold to it. So how can people get the book? Do you have like a website, or how can people reach you to talk to you further about the book or whatever?
Yeah, so to get the book, my favorite thing for you to do is ask your local bookstore to order it for you, because then they'll also know the book exists. But you can get it from any bookstore, or go to WVU Press Online, get it direct from the publisher. My internet website, I'm so old. I'm on the interwebs. I'm Matthew Ferrence, MatthewFerrence.com. On Twitter, Canapalachia. MJ Ferrence on Twitter and on Instagram, both. It's Canapalachia is what you'll see, but that's me.
All right. Well, and the name of the book is I Hate It Here, Please Vote for Me, Essays on Rural Political Decay. And Matthew Ferrence, I'm glad you wrote the book, and I'm really, really glad that you took the time to be on the podcast.
Thanks you so much for having me here. Great conversation.
All right, guys, and we're going to catch y'all on the other side. All right, and we are back. So I want to thank Fred Waitzkin and Matthew Ferrence for coming on, and really for writing these books. You need to read Anything is Good if you want to get into mindset of homelessness and how real it is. Especially how real people can end up in that situation, right? And then Matthew, his chronicling his attempt to run for public office is really, really a timely piece in this day and age. The fact that he was a COVID candidate and all of this toxicity that we're dealing with. It's really, really a timely piece. Totally different environment than when I was running back in the day. So yeah, I'd encourage y'all to get those books. And Matthew's book is I Hate It Here, Please Vote for Me. Right. So again, I'm glad that they came on. Couple of things I wanted to state. By the time this airs, it will be public knowledge that A Moment with Eric Fleming will have been nominated by the Black Podcast Awards for Best News and Political Podcast. So I want to thank y'all for your support. I want to thank Grace for her contribution to improving the program. I want to thank all the guests that have come on to improve the quality of the program. And I'm really, really humbled. This is the second time we've been nominated. We'll find out in a week or so if the podcast won, but just again to be recognized, I'm humbled and greatly appreciate it. Because just being nominated means that people recognize the work that's being done. And, to be able to cover the Democratic Convention and do other things to really try to increase the audience and get more people in tune about what's going on in politics, especially from a black perspective, really means a lot. So I wanted to get that housekeeping out of the way. But before I go, I got to say something about what happened with Tyreek Hill. And I know a lot of people have weighed in on it and all that. But again, as somebody that's been an elected official, a black elected official, as somebody that has been in law enforcement, and I'll be real quick without going over a whole lot of details and all that stuff. But based on what I saw, and in light of the fact that an organization that I used to be a member of tried to justify the action of these officers, and then another organization I used to be a member of in law enforcement endorsed a guy who thinks that people are eating dogs and cats, right? Who's a convicted felon? You got a law enforcement organization endorsing a convicted felon over a prosecutor. That's the world we live in. Okay? But in light of the Tyreek Hill situation, it's like, I don't care if the officers were black, Latino, Asian, white. When you join a law enforcement agency and they tell you that the mission of the agency is to serve and protect, that's not a catchphrase. That's a commitment. You took an oath to uphold the Constitution. You took an oath to upload that mission statement. And the person that you are stopping for a traffic stop, whatever day they were having, it's not a good day for them at that point. And if they don't do anything that will cause physical harm to you, you need to realize that. Not everybody is going to be a model citizen and have their hands 10 and 2 and yes, sir, no, sir. And not everybody's going to do that. Doesn't matter if they're black, doesn't matter if they're white. I've seen more TikTok and YouTube videos with belligerent white people than I've seen with black folks, right? There's even videos trying to instruct you of how to show up an officer about your rights and all that stuff. While I encourage people to be on their best behavior, the reality is I know people are not going to be. And so my job, or any law enforcement officer's job, is to deal with the situation, deal with it as quickly as possible, keep it moving. Because you don't need to be engaged, or you don't need to escalate anything. If you are an officer assigned to a detail at an event, and one of the people who is considered like a star, it's like literally his banner is on the stadium, right? He may not have his, I don't know what it looks like. I think it's just him in uniform, but it's like if it's his helmet is off or whatever, you know who this person is. Once that person identifies with that, keep it moving. If that person doesn't have any warrants, keep it moving. Write the ticket, keep it moving. Doesn't matter if he's being an asshole or not, right? Because there's some people that you expect to be that way, especially with a celebrity status. Because, there's some people that they were colleagues of mine that would say, do you know who I am? And blah, blah, this, that, and the other. Well, as an officer, nobody's above the law. So that doesn't really matter. Now, you have a better chance of getting out of a ticket if you treat the officer politely. But reality is, if you were doing something egregious enough for that officer to stop you, you're probably going to get a ticket or at least a warning, right? So regardless of how that person is, if that person is not trying to fight you, is not trying to harm you in any way, if they're not reaching for a weapon, your job is to handle the situation professionally. You don't pull them out of a car. You don't slam them to the ground. You don't tell them to stop crying. You don't do that. You know, you don't have a timetable when a person sits down. You know, your job is to handle it professionally. If you handle it professionally, then the situation won't escalate. Classic story I like to tell from the jail. So, had an inmate, didn't want to go into a cell. I convinced him to say, hey, man, you know, right now we've got to get you off of the floor and put you in a cell. So it's like, do you want to keep sleeping on the floor? And he was like, no. I said, well, we got a room for you. So he's going up. And then I guess he looks in the room, looking in the cell room, and he's like, I don't want to go in there. And he literally lays down on the ground, right? Like he's not going to move. So I could have very easily been like these officers and physically drug him in and threw him in and then slammed the door. But what I did was I kneeled down and I whispered in his ear. I said, why are you trying to be like Rosa Parks right now? Why are you trying to do all that? And he was a young man. And he looked at me and then he started laughing and he picked up his stuff and he went in. I could have very easily been just like those other officers and showed my authority and all that stuff. But I talked to him like a human being. I used humor and I was able to get what I wanted. There's been many situations where and they tell you this in the academy, whether you paid attention or not, your most effective weapon is your mouth. And not barking commands, but communicating with a person to understand the situation they're in and trying to diffuse the situation. If it gets out of hand, you've been trained to handle it if it gets out of hand. But you control whether it gets out of hand or not to the best of your ability. Your most effective tool is your mouth and the words that come out of your mouth. These officers did not do that. As a matter of fact, their mouth was as much as a weapon as anything they had on their belt in a negative sense, in a destructive sense. Now, I don't think the officers should be fired. I don't think they should be on stadium detail anymore. I think if they're going to get an extra job, you know, they can do something else, maybe a parade or something. Especially if they're going to treat the people that you're the reason why you've got the detail, the players of the team. I don't think you need that job anymore. But, you know, I think sitting on the desk for a couple of weeks, reassess your situation, maybe some mandatory training, conflict resolution training, whatever, and expect them to do better. And the only reason why nobody should be fired in my case is because outside of being embarrassed and humiliated, that was about it. Although from a black perspective, you know, we deal with that too much. And maybe a message should be sent to that extreme, but I don't think so. But I think a message needs to be strongly conveyed that is not how officers are supposed to treat citizens. Doesn't matter if they're the star player of a team or if somebody that lives in the neighborhood. Doesn't matter if they're black, white, Latino, Asian, whatever. You've got to have restraint. You got to have a level of professionalism. You have to have the mindset to de-escalate any situation. You know, some people don't understand that rolling down a window is for their safety and yours. There's no class that teaches the average citizen how to act at a police stop. It's not a requirement in any school. Now, black families tend to do it on their own, and maybe some white families have a talk. I don't know. But there's no class that teaches that, unlike the hours of training you had to go through the academy to get your certification. So that needs to be in your mind, right? And again, if it's not a threatening situation, then the key thing is to handle that situation as professionally as possible so everybody can be on their way. The only racial thing I will say is that you have to look at black people as human beings. Because I think part of the issue is that if you look at a group of people and don't think that they're human or deserve your respect, then you treat them any kind of way. And maybe you need some sensitivity training on that. But this is 2024. Literally, political movements and corporations and elections have been determined by the actions of police officers. A whole city that's a suburb of St. Louis, Missouri, changed their whole city council based on an aggressive action of a police officer. Los Angeles is not the same based on the aggressive actions of police officers. So when you are out there, and we just had a guest talk about how officers are trained, this danger imperative, right? We just had a guest break that down to you. So I've been through that. I get it. But the reality is that we have a higher obligation as a public servant. And we can't let our personal bad day or any past experience determine how we deal with that individual that's in front of us. So in TikTok language, do better. All right. With that, until next time.